Hello everyone, today's video is about the abuses of the uh, Arab historian Ibn Khaldun and his theories. He lived in the 14th century in North Africa and Egypt, and his most famous work is the impressive Muqaddimah, which is in fact just the introduction to a universal history. Ibn Khaldun is best known for his sort of cyclical dynastic history, and that's kind of what I'd like to discuss today, how this theory is misunderstood and abused, and Ibn Khaldun himself is sort of, not sort of, is dehistoricized. Now that's a kind of a heavy word, I guess, but what I mean is people don't think of Ibn Khaldun in his time. They think of him as someone who is sort of a universal figure that we can look at for every period of history. It's kind of related to my video on why I don't agree with a lot of the way the great books education is approached, because what you do is you take something that is very interesting, like Ibn Khaldun's Muqaddimah, and you turn it into something that it really never was, and you decontextualize it. So what prompted this video is sort of my frustration with the misunderstanding of Asabiya, and which I'll define that in a moment, and the abuse of the cyclical dynastic theory. So first, Asabiya is Ibn Khaldun's notion of kind of group cohesiveness, and he says that this is sort of most embodied in kind of a tribal communities. So you could think of, like Turkic nomads in his day, for example, or Bedouins, and Ibn Khaldun was very interested in the Bedouins, and kind of to the point of overly romanticizing them. That comes through in his writings. And the second point is the cyclical dynastic thesis that he presents of history. So what Ibn Khaldun is doing, he's living in the 14th century, North Africa, primarily, and he's living in a world that's undergoing serious changes, and a lot of the states in this region are extremely fragile. You have successive dynasties that kind of come and go, sort of before his lifetime and during his lifetime, and Ibn Khaldun himself kind of has to move from court to court to just earn a living. So this is influencing his thinking. And so he says, okay, so you have tribal, a powerful tribe comes from outside of the civilized world, which for him is urban. And then they overtake it. The first generation is strong, and then the second generation, kind of keeps things going because they're in contact with the first generation. And then by the third generation, it starts to unravel, and then a new tribal confederation comes and overtakes them because they're weak. And you can see why this theory is pretty attractive. It's simplistic. It appeals to kind of like, we need to be tough and all that kind of thing. But this is the problem. Like, you're taking the problem of abusing this model is you're taking Ibn Khaldun and then just creating this universal principle, when clearly he's talking about North Africa, is the world he came from, and for that time, like, that's a pretty accurate thesis. I mean, of what was going on in that world. But even during his lifetime, you have dynasties, Islamic dynasties that were pretty long lasting, or would become long lasting. By the time Um, he's sort of in his adulthood, and even by the time he dies in around 1406, you have the Mamluks of Egypt, that interesting state, not exactly conventional in some ways. I encourage you to read about that. I don't want to get sidetracked, but the Mamluks had been in charge of Egypt for quite some time, and they weren't overtaken by any kind of new force, and they survived until they were conquered by the Ottomans. And the Ottoman Empire, which I don't think Ibn Khaldun could have really foreseen this, but the Ottoman Empire completely breaks this idea of cyclical dynastic history, um, rigidly defined by generations. And so what people do with this theory is they say that Ibn Khaldun was then, he was a sociologist, or he was an economist, but really he was not. His perspective, and I think this needs to be emphasized because it's important to pay respect to his legacy. He was he was an Islamic judge, ultimately. So he was a Sunni Maliki Qadi, jurist, or basically that's how he was educated. And so his goal with society, his sort of perspective was ultimately a moral one. What is the right way to organize society along, the based on Islam? How should we implement that? Um, and that sort of thing. And he, the you can juxtapose the kind of rigidity of the uh, cyclical model, or the way it's been sort of popularized, with uh, the way Ibn Khaldun actually perceived things, which was a little, weird. I mean, people in the Middle Ages are weird, and I'm not saying that to be judgmental, but they had some unusual ideas about the world, and Ibn Khaldun had them too. He was, um, he had this sort of overly romantic view of the Bedouins, that is kind of at odds with how difficult that lifestyle is. He thought that the Bedouins were the most healthy and the most fit people, but really Bedouins in Arabia are, they it's a tough life. They live a tough life, especially in his time. There's not a lot of water in the desert, obviously, so it's going to have long-term consequences. It's especially in Ibn Khaldun's period, you have a lot of violence among the tribes. And this, you can even see this going back to like the biographies of Muhammad, where Muhammad's going in and kind of putting order to all this, because a lot of these tribes are just fighting constantly, and that's sort of one of the uh, benefits that Islam brings to Arabia. Is there's a kind of structure of how we resolve problems, and a moral code and all that sort of thing. But Ibn Khaldun has this overly romantic view of the Bedouin, and we have later observers like T.E. Lawrence, who talks about how this is like a very difficult lifestyle. The Bedouins die very young, relatively speaking, 40s, 50s, quite often. It's not easy. Um, and then Ibn Khaldun has some strange ideas about like the economy, but strange, but makes sense given his outlook. So since he's a Islamic theologian, he looks at, okay, you have cities, and he says that urban development is actually negative, because urban areas bring about more kind of moral corruption and this kind of thing. So you would think, or if you looked at it kind of overly critically, you'd say, well, okay, if you have a dynasty, you need like an economy, to sustain it and grow it. But Ibn Khaldun would say, no, you don't want too much of an economy. You don't want too much urban development, because that just breeds weakness. So there, you kind of have a sort of a inconsistency there. Although, maybe Ibn Khaldun brings Marshall's more evidence to support that. But certainly, in the case of the Mamluk dynasty, after the Black Death moves through Egypt, I mean, it's really crippling. I mean, to them, and that is a completely non-human event that all it does is really weaken the Mamluk economy. It doesn't make them stronger. You have there's reports of sort of Mamluk Cairo during and after the plague, where you just have entire districts that are suddenly empty. So okay, maybe you've gotten rid of the urban population, but that's really kind of a problem, right? But not to be again too negative toward Ibn Khaldun. He's thinking from a certain perspective, and it's an interesting one, but it's one that needs to be considered before we sort of uncritically accept him as a kind of sociologist or a modern philosopher of history. And the last point I'd like to discuss is sort of the reception of Ibn Khaldun and how he kind of is known to us today, because in his own period, the Muqaddimah is an introduction to a universal history. So these are texts historical works. They start from creation of the world up to basically the lifetime of the author, typically in the Islamic world. And so the Muqaddimah that everyone reads today, or a lot of people like to read today, is just the introduction to his universal history, which was titled the Kitab al-Ibar wa Divan al-Muqtada wal-Khabar fi Tarikh al-Arab wal-Barbar wa man asrahum min Dawi Ashan al-Akhbar. Book of Lessons, Record of Beginnings and Events of History of the Arabs and Berbers and their powerful contemporaries. And he starts with the Berbers, which I think is quite interesting. But at any rate, so this is just the introduction to a larger historical project. And but in his lifetime, he was not widely copied. His ideas were not well received, as far as we can tell. And usually with a manuscript tradition, the way you can tell that is the number of extant copies. How you would go about that. And really, in Islamic history, the reception of Ibn Khaldun, at least from what I know in the Ottoman world, you don't really start to see the kind of reception of Ibn Khaldun in a clear way that we can identify until like the 17th century. And by then, sort of an Ottoman intellectual thought, they had already sort of developed their own ideas. They did have something kind of like the cyclical dynastic thesis, but and that's embodied in the works of Mustafa Ali, the Ottoman scholar I talked about in another video, or I mentioned in another video. He in his universal histories, this is in the 16th century, does profile a bunch of dynasties and shows how they fell, but he doesn't really ascribe a kind of rigid scheme to it. He talks about discrete cases where these things went wrong or were not corrected, and that's what caused the dynasty to unravel. He talks about like Ghaznavids and some of these other dynasties. And then later, it's not until even much later that Ibn Khaldun is sort of discovered by the Orientalist scholars in the 19th century, early 20th century, and becomes a very interesting figure, and he is or a figure of interest to Western scholarship. But again, how much was he received before that? It's not really as wide as people may assume. And this is all to say that when we talk about these kind of thinkers or these great works, we keep this sort of reception history in mind, because it's one thing to say something is a great book, but then that gives you a kind of distorted view of the past. And I think the abuse of Ibn Khaldun is a good example of this, where you take someone that is interesting, but was not really a significant figure. This is also the kind of problem that can be created when we're looking at, particularly in Islamic history, where we find a manuscript that's really interesting and unique, but that can almost present a problem, because if it's unique and it's not really copied, if there's one copy, well, that's not really giving you an impression of what the literate people were reading and what they were thinking. And you can see, like, in Ottoman history, there are estate registers that include what books people were reading, and quite often it's the kind of thing that you would expect. The Quran, and then popular religious tracts or popular biographies of Muhammad or the other prophets in Islam, and that sort of thing. So there's always have to be careful with finding a work that is supposedly unique, and just because it's unique doesn't mean it was impactful, and can often mean it was not very impactful. So it's the importance of knowing kind of the reception of a text when we can know it. And I guess that brings me to the end of my discussion here. Should we not read Ibn Khaldun anymore, or should we cast him aside? No. But we need to be careful when we're looking at theories like Ibn Khaldun's without historical context, and just imposing them on everything. They don't always fit, and they didn't always even fit in his own time. But we should kind of strive to do that, keep that all in mind. So I may revisit this subject in the future, but I recommend people read Robert Irwin's intellectual biography of Ibn Khaldun, that influenced my thinking on this a lot. I mean, it was kind of thoughts I had already, but Irwin had already written a book that was, very similar to what I was thinking. So I was very happy when I found that book. And Irwin passed away a year or two ago, but also an interesting scholar, worth checking out. So, okay, thank you for watching or listening, and have a good day.